I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about how does power work according to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is a historian and philosopher who is so influential that he is apparently the most cited thinker in academic research, with his work used not just in philosophy but also the social sciences. He was born in 1926 in France and passed away in 1984 from AIDS. Based on his genealogical and archaeological method, his most famous works are historical analysis of social constructions such as prisons, madness, medicine, the human sciences, and sexuality. While these contain a history of the disciplines and its institutions, they are works of historical interpretation, where he makes a coherent line of argumentation of how they come to be the way they are. One of the most important lines of argumentation Foucault makes uses his conception of power. Foucault's concept of power and its relation to knowledge is among his major contributions to the history of thought. His first volume of the History of Sexuality, written in 1976, contains the key ideas of his conception of power, specifically the chapter named Method, which is part 4, chapter 2 of the book. Foucault has a novel way of looking at power, quite contrary to how people commonly understand power. Firstly, a common conception is that power is imposed from the top by a mastermind, be it an individual or an elite group, orchestrating the entire state of affairs. Foucault disputes that and says that power instead comes from the bottom up. Secondly, it is commonly thought that how the authorities exert power over the masses is through repressive measures such as laws, which prohibits people from doing something. While that may be the case, it is not the only way, with control mechanisms evolving to be more sophisticated, shifting from the repressive to the productive. Specifically on sex, controls using prohibitions on forms of sex considered deviant, such as premarital sex and homosexuality, have shifted to a production of norms and scientific discourse which shapes how we understand sexuality. Instead of merely exerting a repressive power through prohibitions, what is added, sometimes replacing repressive power altogether, is a normalizing power. Using a mechanism of normalizing power may be even more effective to control a population, since its members now monitor themselves so as to conform to the norms. However, to understand how such a shift is even possible, we have to understand how Foucault conceives of power. For Foucault, power does not begin from the dominance of one group over another, though that may be its end result. To him, power is a series of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. Power is a series of relations of localized power. It is a process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses power relations. This struggle or cooperation can be between people and can take place through physical struggle such as violence, or it can take place through discourse, that is, through discussion. It is the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another. If there are sufficient points of agreement, the various power relations can support one another to form a strategy which manifests as a system, though how the form of the system is will be shaped by the points and extents of the agreements and conflicts. The analogy that comes to my mind is how power is atomistic in Foucault's view, what he calls local. Like atoms, they can combine to form more complex molecules, which will represent a system of power relations. Which molecules are formed depend on the nature of the underlying atoms. Sometimes the different atoms have enough attraction to one another to form a molecule. Sometimes they do not and then remain as separate atoms. Contrary to common belief, there is no mastermind prominently visible or behind the scenes, orchestrating the entire state of affairs. The sources of power are instead local, originating from within their own sphere and can be influenced and modified by other competing or complementary points of power. These points of power organize themselves also locally and not centrally. These points of power may support or oppose one another, which then leads to them fighting, changing, supporting, or opposing one another. As this process develops, this mutual support and transformation may lead to a coherent system or may never be able to come together. If they cohere at the end of this process, this system may be implemented in the design of state institutions, shape laws, or concentrate powers in social groups, but that is the end result. It does not begin as a centralized body of power. It begins from disparate points of power which may end up unified. It is the moving substrate of force relations which, by virtue of their inequality, constantly engender states of power. But the latter, these states of power, are always local and unstable, adds Foucault. Power seems to be everywhere, but not because it has brought everything under its control. Instead, it is because power relations have been produced. This production is continually occurring, developing in each force relation between the local points of power. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere, notes Foucault. What seems to be an overarching single unified power is merely the sum of these relations. Foucault asserts that it is not a structure, but a chain, a network whose nodes and links can be reformed as the situation develops. This point of Foucault's is confusing, since even a chain or a network is a structure. What I understand by his refutation of structure is that the power structure is not something fixed and unchanging, the way a building structure is solid and stable, but instead is a living web which evolves along with events. On this basis, Foucault advances a series of propositions. Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one holds on to or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations, he writes. This view may be surprising, given that many may picture power, for instance in war, as one group grabbing by force another group's land, and in that way taking all the power. According to Foucault, power is never taken away from the victim. Their power remains, with their resistance being a manifestation of that power, even if this power is less than the aggressor's power. The balance of power can shift, but one's power is not something that can be taken over by the other. Power is instead something one exercises, something one exerts. This suggests to me that if one is not exercising one's power, then effectively the power is not there in the sense that it is not felt. Back to my example, if the victims of the land grab do not put up any resistance, then some may think that they have given up their power to the aggressor. But my interpretation of this proposition of Foucault's is that power remains in the hands of both parties. It remains in play since at a later time the victims could make a challenge or decide to resist. The battle is not over, and short of the total annihilation of one party, may never be. Where there is power, there is resistance, writes Foucault. This resistance is not external to the power but inherent in it. Power, in fact, depends on the points of resistance, which play the role of adversary, target, support, or handle in power relations. Just like there is no single overarching source of power, there is no great single source of resistance but many points of resistance. Lest resistance be thought of only as a reaction to power, Foucault refutes that notion. He considers resistance as the odd term in relations of power, something oppositional that is part of the power relation, like how the yin is unavoidably there in the yang. The points of resistance are not uniformly distributed and hence affect different parts of the body to different extents. They also shift and transform. Just as the network of power relations ends by forming a dense web that passes through apparatuses and institutions without being exactly localized in them, so too the swamp of points of resistance traverses social stratifications and individual unities, writes Foucault. The power relations form a web that affect the social machinery. Since resistance is part of these relations, likewise resistance also affects the social machinery. He adds, the strategic codification of these points of resistance makes a revolution possible. By understanding that there exists points of resistance, their nature and where they are, and then organizing them into a codex or a schema, a plan. These resistances, which are themselves powers, can be used to change and overthrow the prevailing order. Relations of power are not external to other types of relations, such as economic, knowledge, or sexual relations. Power relations are inherent to these other relations. It surfaces because of the imbalances within these relations. An example I can think of is the economic relation of an employer to an employee. Both have their own power, one as the provider of employment and the other as a supplier of labor. Perhaps worker A needs his employer more than his employer needs him, and hence the employer has more power over him. Both have their own power, but because the power is imbalanced in their economic relationship, there is a power relation in their economic relationship. Power is not superstructural. It is not something overarching that regulates what is below it through what it prohibits or approves, but is more direct and is productive in the sense that power does not just restrict but produces things like norms. Using the same example of the employer-employee economic relationship, it is not that the power relation arises solely from the hierarchical structure of a company, the superstructure in this case. The worker can have more power than the employer if his skills are in high demand, for instance, such that he can always quit and find another job easily, and so he need not accede to unreasonable orders from his boss. For his boss to get the worker to accede to the difficult requests, she can, for instance, provide resources or give incentives. So in that way, the power she exerts is direct and productive in the sense that she is not just issuing an order, but is involved directly in producing resources to support her worker. In Foucault's concept, power comes from below. However, it is not a binary of the ruler versus the ruled, of one opposed to the other. A common notion people may have is that power comes from the top and are imposed on groups below. Foucault rejects this. Instead, many relations of power take place on a micro level, such as families, small groupings, and marginal institutions, and are where divisions may occur. Aggregated, these divisions could become a rift that runs through all of society, bringing about major alignments and leading to a confrontation between opposing sides. One example of this is how gender preference may be a rift that runs in the family, in companies, and writ large across society. Another could be how even at a local level, for instance in a family, or also in small groups of friends or work teams, body beautiful people are favored over less body beautiful people, with this preference then also appearing at a societal level. When such alignments are common at a local level, it can then give rise to hegemonic effects of domination at the societal level. According to Foucault, power relations are intentional and non-subjective. They are intentional because they have aims, though Foucault denies that these aims are formulated by individuals or even groups. The exercise of power begins locally with a local rationale, connecting up with other powers to form coherent and comprehensive systems. It is not planned by anyone. An example I thought of is, say one athlete wants to perform well and based on that rationale takes steroids. Other athletes, seeing the athlete do well, may then also consume steroids, finally leading to performance-enhancing drugs being systematically used in sports, becoming part of how sports is played. No one masterminded this move. It began as an individual event and ended up as a system-wide norm. Foucault applies his concept of power to analyze societal discourse about sex. Discourse is physically manifested as the speech, conversation, and writings of people. Discourse through these manifestations produce knowledge and meaning. Foucault will explain that how a particular discourse comes to be the prevailing discourse is driven by the various power relations surrounding the topic. Hence, to understand why some societies regard sex the way they do, for instance, that it is reserved for a marital relationship, that is for the purpose of procreation, and the legitimate form is between a man and a woman, or within a loving relationship, and so on, which in a different society or epoch may seem like just so many prejudices. We need to ask, what are the most local power relations at work? Foucault proposes 4 rules for his method to analyze local power relations and discourse. 1. Rule of immanence. 2. Rules of continual variations. 3. Rule of double conditioning. And 4. Rule of the tactical polyvalence of discourses. Rule number 1. Rule of immanence. Scientific investigation is purported to be objective and disinterested, that is, concerned with the facts and is not affected by the peculiarities of the specific people under study. Foucault problematizes this notion. He writes, if sexuality was constituted as an area of scientific investigation, this was only because relations of power had established it as a possible object. He defines sexuality as a network of the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances. Scientific investigations on sex are supposed to give us an objective knowledge to inform our discourse on sex. But because it is a certain power that makes sex a matter of scientific investigation, this scientific investigation is imbued with the economic or ideological requirements of that power, making such investigation not neutral. Foucault asserts that techniques to gain knowledge are part of a strategy to exert power. That is, knowledge is immanent or internal to gaining power. He terms this power knowledge, power-knowledge. His examples of power knowledge with regard to sexuality are the power relation between a priest and the believer who comes to confess to him, or a patient who tells his medical doctor or psychologist about their sex life. Other local centers of power knowledge include parents with their children and educators with their students. These power relations are tilted to the side of the expert or the patriarch. 2. Rules of continual variations. However, instead of looking for who has more power and who has less, what needs to be understood is what the relationship of power will cause to unfold. The strengths of each node constituting the power relations are not static, they vary. Foucault's example is how the power relation used to be between the doctors and the parents together, in relation to the child's sexuality, but that has become a relation of the child and psychiatrist together in relation to the sexuality of the parents. 3. Rule of double conditioning. The local level of power relations feed into a bigger strategy, while the bigger strategy affects the local level. However, the local level is not where the bigger strategy applies itself on if it wants to achieve comprehensive effects, but it uses the local level as an anchor point. The levels bleed into each other, are continuous and not distinct. Neither are they just different scales of the same phenomena, but are instead different phenomena. It is common to think of the family as an analog of the state as a way to understand power and control, but Foucault thinks this is mistaken. Instead, the family is an anchor point used to support bigger strategies such as population control through their individual birth rates. Rule 4. Rule of the tactical polyvalence of discourses. It is in discourse that power and knowledge are joined together, writes Foucault. Discourse on the topic is how we collectively understand, how we speak together about the topic. It is not just one account of the matter, but contains various different viewpoints on the matter. It is a series of discontinuous segments, and these segments are neither uniform nor stable. Discourse is not a binary between accepted discourse and excluded discourse, or between the dominant discourse and the dominated one. It is instead a multiplicity of discursive elements. Hence, to analyze a discourse, we need to reconstruct how these elements are distributed and how they are used. Discourse and silence are not subservient to power or raised up against it, since while they can serve as tools and outcomes of power, they can also be obstacles and points of resistance. In that way, discourse transmits and produces power, but it can also undermine and expose it. Foucault explains how the discourse on sodomy and homosexuality made possible a strong advance of social controls, but also made possible an opposing discourse of tolerance. Discourses should not be understood in binary terms, but instead as tactical elements operating in power relations. The same discourse can be used first in one strategy and then in an opposite one. Hence, to understand how discourse is being used in power strategies, we need to inquire about their tactical productivity, what effects of power and knowledge they support, and their strategic integration, which power relation makes use of them. In conclusion, Foucault provides a new way of thinking about power, away from the binary of the ruler versus the ruled or the powerful versus the powerless. According to him, that would be mistaking the effect for its cause. Instead, power should be understood as a series of local power relations within a network of multiple elements or nodes. Though the elements all have their own power, which cannot be stolen by other elements, collectively there will be areas of agreement and fault lines of discord, which then gives rise to alignments which may lead to dominant positions. To uncover these power relations, we need to understand the historical development of the discourse surrounding that topic and how discourse is employed by the prevailing power strategy. Thank you.